I hadn't thought about my ex in almost a year, not since the last message I deleted without reading, the one that came at 2:17 a.m. when people only write if they're lonely, drunk or desperate, and I was finally done being any of those for her. So when I saw her mother's name flash on my phone that afternoon, my first instinct wasn't curiosity, but irritation, the kind that crawls up your spine and whispers, "You should ignore it because nothing good ever comes from reopening old doors, especially the ones you slammed shut to save yourself." Yet something in me paused, maybe habit, maybe unfinished business, maybe the quiet guilt that never fully dies when love ends badly. And I answered, expecting small talk or a polite lie about checking in. But instead she said my name softly, like she already knew I was going to say yes, and asked if I could stop by because she had something to show me, something important. And before I could even ask what she meant, she laughed under her breath and said, "You'll understand when you see it," which should have been my cue to hang up. But instead, I found myself driving toward the house I once considered a second home, the same road where my ex and I used to argue and make up and promise futures we were never strong enough to build. And the closer I got, the heavier my chest felt, like memory itself was pressing against my ribs, warning me that some places don't forget you, even if you forget them. And when I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same, white walls, neatly trimmed hedges, the porch light still, broken and flickering like it had been for years, and that familiarity was almost worse than if everything had changed, because it made me feel like time had been moving without permission, that life had kept going there, while mine had fractured elsewhere. And when the door opened, it wasn't my ex who greeted me, but her mother, standing there with the same calm smile she always had. The one that made you feel seen and judged at the same time. The smile that never quite reached her eyes. And she hugged me like no time had passed. Like I hadn't disappeared from her daughter's life in a storm of words and tears and slammed doors. And then she stepped back, looked me up and down and said, "You look tired." Not as an insult, but as a statement of fact. And I laughed awkwardly because she was right. Because heartbreak ages you in ways mirrors don't show until it's too late. And she gestured for me to come inside. And the smell hit me instantly, coffee, old books, and that faint lavender scent she always used, which triggered a rush of memories so vivid I had to stop myself from calling out my ex's name out of habit. But the house was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels intentional. And I asked where she was. And her mother didn't answer right away. Just walked toward the living room and said, "Sit," like she had something planned. And I obeyed without realizing why, settling into the same couch where I once fell asleep holding her daughter's hand during a blackout. And her mother disappeared into the kitchen before returning with 2 cups of tea I hadn't asked for, setting them down carefully, deliberately, like every movement mattered. And then she finally looked at me fully, studying my face in a way that made me uncomfortable, and said, "You know, you were the only one who ever really understood her." And that sentence hit harder than any insult could have, because it wasn't true, not anymore. Not after everything that went wrong, not after the nights I felt invisible, even while lying beside her, not after love turned into something sharp and exhausting. And I started to respond. But her mother raised a hand gently, stopping me, and said, "I'm not blaming you," which somehow made it worse, because it implied there was blame to be placed. And then she leaned forward, her voice dropping, and said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd stayed?" And that question opened a door in my mind I'd boarded up for survival, the what-ifs rushing out like trapped air. And before I could stop myself, I said yes. Because honesty slips when you're caught off guard. And she smiled then, not warmly, not kindly, but knowingly, and said, "Good," and stood up, walking toward the hallway, and called over her shoulder, "Come with me." And every instinct told me to leave, to make an excuse, to say I had somewhere else to be. But my legs moved anyway, carrying me down the same hallway, where framed photos told a story of a family that looked happier than it ever really was. And we stopped in front of a door I had never been inside before, a door that had always been locked. And I asked what was in there, and her mother turned to me, her eyes sharp now, and smiled that same unsettling smile before saying the words that still echo in my head. Even now. Want to see? And in that moment I didn't blink. Not because I was brave, but because I was afraid that if I did, something irreversible would happen. Something I couldn't unsee. Something that would finally explain everything that went wrong between me and the woman I once loved. And as she reached for the handle, I realized too late that some truths don't set you free. They trap you forever. And if you're still listening right now, still breathing through this tension, know this: stories like this don't end cleanly. They unfold slowly, painfully. And if you don't want to miss what happens when that door finally opens, when the past stops whispering and starts screaming, then stay with me. Subscribe to this channel. Because what she showed me next changed everything I thought I knew about love, betrayal, and the price of walking away.